The wind tore through the trees like it wanted to peel the bark from them. Snow didn't fall gently, it slammed sideways, stinging cheeks and blinding eyes. The wagon train pushed west through the wilderness of Ohio Territory, half-starved and worn thin from weeks of winter hardship. And in the back of the final wagon, barely covered by a patchy wool blanket, lay a sickly girl named Millie. She was only 8 years old, with large eyes that looked too big for her pale face. Her thin arms trembled with fever, and every few minutes, a dry, hacking cough racked her body. Blood sometimes flecked her lips, and her breath came in short gasps. The others in the train tried to ignore her sound, tried to focus on the trail, the cold, and the hope of reaching somewhere, anywhere, safer than this endless snow. But Millie's stepfather, a hard-jawed man named Emmett Rawls, had already made up his mind. "She ain't gonna make it," he muttered to his wife, Ruth, a woman worn to the bone by sorrow and silence. "We can't afford to lose another horse or break another axle carrying her dead weight." "She's just a child," Ruth whispered, eyes red with grief. "She's your daughter now. She ain't mine." "She was your first man's mistake," Emmett snapped, tightening the reins. "And I ain't burying another in frozen dirt." They stopped that afternoon to water the horses and tend to frozen fingers and numb toes. Emmett climbed into the back of the wagon while Ruth pretended to tend the fire, her face turned away, tears freezing on her cheeks. He looked down at Millie. She tried to smile at him weakly. Her lips cracked from the cold. "Please," she whispered. "I'll get better, I promise." But there was no mercy in Emmett Rawls. He lifted her frail body in one swift motion and stepped down from the wagon. She was light, too light. Nothing but skin, bones, and fevered breath. "What are you doing?" Someone muttered, but no one moved to stop him. He carried her about 20 yards from the trail and dropped her in the snow beside a crooked pine. No blanket, no coat. Just her thin cotton dress and a faint whimper. "If the good Lord wants you to live, He'll see to it." And with that, Emmett turned his back. Ruth's scream never came. She just fell to her knees beside the fire, pressing her fist to her mouth to stop the sobs. None of the others spoke up, not the old trapper with frostbitten hands, not the preacher too tired to pray. Not even the mother of 3 who'd buried one child just last week. They moved on before sundown. The wind howled louder that night, and the snow covered Millie like a slow-moving shroud. She tried to cry, but her tears froze. She tried to shout, but her lungs gave only a wheeze. Every breath felt heavier than the last, and soon the child lay still, curled up like a forgotten lamb left to die in the cold. But she was not alone. Not far beyond the trees, cloaked in deerskin and shadow, a man stood watching. He was Shawnee, tall, silent, and still as stone. His name was Taqua, and he had been trailing the wagons for days. At first, he'd watched them from caution, unsure if they posed danger to his people. Then curiosity took over how these pale settlers moved like ghosts across sacred land. But when he saw the girl cast aside, something inside him stirred. He watched her lie in the snow, unmoving. The wind caught her thin hair and played with it like a cruel hand. Taqua could have turned away. Should have, perhaps. His people had lost too much already. The white man brought disease, war, and pain. They had taken his daughter 2 winters ago. She died of fever in his arms. He had not spoken since, but now this child left for dead called to a piece of him that hadn't fully died. Slowly, silently, he stepped out from the trees. The snow crunched softly beneath his moccasins. His long black hair was braided down. His back, his breath puffed in the cold. He knelt beside the girl and placed a hand on her forehead. Still warm, still alive. He did not speak. He simply gathered her into his arms, cradling her as gently as a father would hold a newborn. She stirred faintly, eyes fluttering open for just a second. In that moment, she saw only his eyes, deep, dark, steady. Then she faded again. Without a sound, Takwa turned toward the trees and vanished into the white, and the trail behind him disappeared under fresh falling snow. The wind had slowed, but the cold was worse than ever, sharp and hungry, the kind that could reach inside a man's bones and still not be satisfied. Millie's breath came in weak bursts, the frost clinging to her lashes like tiny daggers. But she was no longer alone. Takwa moved through the forest like a shadow, careful to leave no prints behind. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but he stepped light, balancing Millie in his arms as if she were made of ash. Her fevered head rested against his chest, and her hands, red from exposure, twitched once or twice, instinctively reaching for warmth. He didn't speak. He hadn't spoken a word in nearly 2 years. Instead, his silence carried everything: his grief, his oath, his sorrow, and now, his strange, unexpected duty. He had watched the wagon since they crossed into the valley, watched how the white settlers argued, how they burned too much wood, wasted meat, ignored signs of storm. He didn't pity them. Their kind had taken too much from his people to deserve pity. But then came the girl. When she was thrown from the wagon, he stood hidden behind a cedar thicket, eyes narrowed, heart burning. He waited, perhaps expecting one of them to return, a mother, a brother, even the coward who tossed her like garbage. But no one came. The wagons had kept moving. Only the snow had returned for her. That was when he stepped from the trees. Now he was deep in the woods, moving, quickly but carefully. He knew these trails. His father had taught him every turn, every hill, every hidden hollow where fire wouldn't be seen and footprints would vanish with a breeze. He crossed a frozen creek, the ice groaning beneath his weight. He shifted, pausing to listen, not just for danger but for signs of the girl's breath. It came faintly, like wind against dry leaves. She was slipping. He adjusted his furs around her, drawing his own buffalo hide coat tighter to shield her from the worst of it. Her skin felt like cold stone. Still, she was alive. As long as he kept moving, she might stay that way. At last, Takwa reached the mouth of a small cave set into a ridge, camouflaged by branches and stone. It was an old hunting shelter used only in the direst winters and forgotten by most. He ducked inside, still holding her, and laid her gently on a bed of old pine needles and hides. Then he went to work. He stacked twigs and moss with methodical care. Flint sparked against steel, and a small flame came to life. Within minutes, the fire grew warm and steady, casting golden light on the stone walls. He placed a clay pot over it, melting snow into water, then added dried roots and herbs from a pouch at his waist. His grandmother's medicine, bitter but healing. Millie moaned softly. Her eyes flickered. She whispered something, his name. No, she didn't know it. She didn't need to. He knelt beside her, holding a warm cloth to her face. Her skin was blotchy and pale, but not yet beyond saving. Her lips moved again. Ma. The word cut through him sharper than any blade. He remembered his own daughter, Wagon, sick and burning with fever, calling out in Shawnee for her mother long after her mother had died. He had stayed by her every moment, trying to break the fever, feeding her broth, singing to her. And still she had faded. Died before the thaw. He hadn't sung since. He hadn't touched a child or even spoken a word. But now, Takwa reached for a carved figure tucked into his satchel. It was old, and worn a bear cub with round ears and a crooked paw. Wagon had held it when she was ill, gripping it so tight the paint had worn off. He placed it beside Millie's hand. She didn't grab it, but her fingers twitched toward it. He sat down beside her, cross-legged, unmoving. He watched the fire dance in the stones, listened to her shallow breath. The blizzard howled outside the cave mouth, but here inside, There was warmth. A pulse. A flicker of hope. Takwa closed his eyes and, without realizing it, began to hum low, soft, the melody of a lullaby he thought he'd buried with his daughter. The girl didn't stir, but the air shifted, something small and invisible, passing between them. A promise made in silence. He would not let her die. Not again. Inside the small cave, the fire glowed like a heartbeat against the stone walls. It crackled gently, pushing back the icy grip of the storm outside. Millie lay wrapped in fur, buffalo deer, even rabbit hides layered thick beneath and around. Her frail body, her skin, once ice cold, now held the faintest warmth, and her breath came a little deeper than before. Takwa sat nearby, silent and still, watching the girl the way one watches an injured bird, careful not to startle it, not to give up too soon, not to get too hopeful. Her cheeks were still pale and sunken, but color was beginning to return in her fingertips. He dipped a cloth in the herbal broth he had brewed and gently dabbed it across her brow. Her skin twitched beneath his touch. Then, slowly, her eyes fluttered. Open. At first, she didn't seem to see him. She stared at the fire, her gaze unfocused, lips dry and cracked. But then her eyes shifted, and she noticed the man beside her. A stranger, a Shawnee. Her body tensed, though she was too weak to move. Fear crept into her face, but Takwa didn't move either. He simply stared back, his face calm, his hands resting on his knees. His eyes dark and steady, held no cruelty, no threat, just something she couldn't name. Something quiet. He reached slowly for a bowl and offered it to her, just steam at first, then the earthy smell of roots, berries, and something bitter she didn't recognize. She hesitated, too weak to lift her arms. He gently brought the bowl to her lips, letting her sip. She gagged at the taste, but her stomach, long empty, accepted it. "Thank you," she croaked, barely audible. Takwa didn't respond. He hadn't spoken since the day his daughter died. Words had become like broken arrows, useless and dangerous. But still, he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. A soft gesture, enough. Millie drifted in and out of sleep. Each time she opened her eyes, the fire was still burning, and the strange man was still there, always awake, always watching. She didn't understand who he was or why he'd helped her. But for the first time since the trail began, since her stepfather's harsh voice and her mother's empty silence, she felt safe. On the third day, when the fever had broken and her lips could form sentences again, she whispered, "Why did you take me?" Takwa looked at her for a long time, then simply lifted a carved figure from beside her bed. The small wooden bear, worn smooth from age, now rested in her hand. Her fingers curled around it without thinking. "This yours?" she asked. He nodded. "Was it your child's?" Another nod. Millie looked at the bear, then back at him. "She die?" Takwa didn't blink, but his jaw tightened just slightly. The fire crackled. That was answer enough. "I'm sorry," Millie said, in a voice so soft it almost vanished in the flames. They sat in silence again. But it was a different silence now. Not fear, not tension. It was the quiet of people who had both been broken by the same kind of loss. Later that evening, Takwa pulled a piece of dried leather and began carving a new figure. He worked silently, his knife moving steadily, carefully. Millie watched, fascinated. Her thin arms still too weak to do much more than lift a cup or cradle the old bear. "What are you making?" He didn't answer, but didn't stop either. When he finished, he held it out to her, a tiny bird, wings folded in sleep. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Is it for me?" He gave a slow nod. She clutched it in both hands and stared at him for a long while. "What's your name?" He looked at her, then pressed his hand to his chest. "Takwa," she guessed. A pause. He nodded once. She smiled weakly. "I'm Millie." There it was. A beginning. Two names exchanged across fire and silence. As night fell, Takwa adjusted the furs around her, stirred the fire one last time, and then leaned against the wall of the cave, arms crossed. He still didn't speak. But Millie, nestled between the bear and the bird, knew he would not let the fire go out. Not while she slept. Not while she healed. Not while he still had breath in his body. She closed her eyes and dreamed of warmth for the first time in weeks. The blizzard finally passed. On the fifth day, leaving the forest heavy with snow and silence. Pine branches bent low beneath white weight, and the world outside the small cave looked still as death. But inside, life stirred. Millie sat propped against a pile of pelts, her cheeks now carrying a faint pink hue and her lips no longer cracked. Her fever had broken, and though her body remained weak, her eyes were sharper, watchful, curious, alive. Tak, knelt by the fire, grinding herbs in a small stone bowl. He hadn't spoken a single word since rescuing her, but Millie had learned to understand him anyway, through nods, through glances, through the quiet way he moved. There was a language in his silence, and she was beginning to read it. "You're always up before me," she said softly, watching him with quiet amusement. "You ever sleep?" He didn't answer, but a hint of a smile played at the corners of his mouth. That was new. She liked it. She tried to rise on her own that morning and nearly toppled over. Takwa caught her before she hit the stone floor. His hand strong but gentle. He didn't scold, didn't make a sound. He simply helped her sit and placed a warm bowl of broth in her lap. "Thanks," she murmured. "I hate this stuff, but I guess it's why I'm not dead, so—" Still, no reply. Millie blew on the steaming broth. "You're the quietest person I've ever met. My stepfather was the loudest. Loud when he was drunk. Loud when he was mad. Loud even when he was lying." She hesitated, then looked up. "You're nothing like him." Takwa paused his work for a moment and met her eyes. His face remained unreadable, but his steady presence told her he was listening. He always listened. Over the next few days, Millie began to move around the cave slowly. At first, dragging one leg behind her like a wounded fawn. Takwa would steady her arm now and then, but he never hovered. He gave her space to try, to fall, to get up again. When her strength returned enough to walk from the fire to the cave mouth, she saw the world blanketed in snow, untouched, endless. "Do you live here?" she asked him one morning. He shook his head. "Are we close to your village?" Another slow shake. Then, "Are you taking me somewhere?" A nod. She took a breath. "Back to the wagon train?" Takwa's expression darkened for the briefest second. He looked away and resumed sharpening his knife. Millie lowered her gaze. "I didn't think so." There were questions she wanted to ask: why he'd saved her, what he planned to do, whether he blamed her for the color of her skin, but she held them back. She didn't want to break the fragile peace they'd found. One afternoon, while the fire burned low, Takwa pulled out a strip of rawhide and handed it to her, along with a small bone needle. He motioned a sewing gesture with his hand and pointed at a tear in her dress. "You want me to sew?" she asked, startled. He nodded, then crouched beside her and showed her how to loop the thread and pinch the fabric. Her stitches were crooked, but each one steadied her fingers and her heart. It had been so long since anyone had believed she could be useful. By evening, Takwa handed her a piece of wood and his knife. He mimed the carving motion. "You want me to carve something?" He nodded. She raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you worried I'll cut off a finger?" His only reply was a shrug and the faintest flicker of a smile. It felt like a reward. She carved. It was clumsy and rough and didn't resemble anything, but she was learning and he was patient. On the seventh night, she offered him something unexpected, her voice. "You want to hear something funny?" she asked. He raised an eyebrow. "I used to sing. before everything. Before Mom married Emmett. Before the Wagons. I used to hum to myself when I couldn't sleep. She glanced at him. You mind? Takwa didn't move. But something in the way he set down his knife said he was listening again. So Millie, in a soft, cracked voice, began to hum. It was a lullaby half remembered, the words lost to time, but the tune was gentle, sad, hopeful. Takwa closed his eyes. And for the first time since he'd carried her from the snow, a word whispered across his mind like smoke from a fading fire. Daughter. The days grew longer. The snow, once cruel and choking, softened beneath a rising sun. Drips of meltwater tapped from pine branches, and the wind no longer howled, it whispered. Inside the cave, Millie had grown stronger. She could now walk short distances without help. Her cheeks carried color, and her voice came with more confidence. She still couldn't run, but she could laugh again, and sometimes in quiet moments she did. Takwa kept watch. Even as he prepared snares for small game or taught Millie how to twist cord from bark, his eyes often flicked toward the tree line. He was listening for something out of place, something unwelcome. He didn't tell Millie, but his instincts had begun to itch. Birds flew too quickly through the trees. A distant echo of horses had reached his ears the day before, far off but unmistakable. The forest was not empty. Millie noticed the change in him. You're quiet today, she said, sitting beside the fire and polishing her third attempt at a wooden animal. It was supposed to be a fox, but it looked more like a dog with no ears. Takwa glanced at her, nodded once, then returned to checking his bow. You think someone's coming? She asked, her voice suddenly small. He paused, then nodded again. Her throat tightened. The Wagon people? No answer, but she knew. By midday, Takwa had packed most of their belongings into 2 small bundles. He didn't explain. He didn't have to. Millie saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he moved faster than usual, more focused. They would have left that evening if the danger hadn't arrived first. It came with the crunch of snow and the soft jingle of a bridle. Millie was the first to hear it, sitting at the cave entrance while Takwa skinned a rabbit by the fire. She froze. Takwa, she whispered urgently, turning her head. There's someone? Horses. He rose in an instant, silent and alert. With one smooth motion, he grabbed his bow and stepped forward to shield her. His eyes narrowed, scanning the slope beyond the trees. A group of 3 riders emerged from the woods, 2 men and 1 teenage boy. All armed, all wrapped in furs, but clearly settlers. Millie's breath hitched. She recognized the man in the middle. Mr. Hodges, she murmured. He was with the wagon train. He was Emmett's friend. The men hadn't seen them yet, but they were close, too close. Takwa stepped in front of Millie and motioned for her to stay back. She obeyed. Hey, the lead man shouted, spotting movement. He raised his rifle slightly. You there. Takwa stood tall, bow in hand, but didn't speak. He made no move to flee, only watched. The 3 men rode closer, suspicion and aggression in their posture. Well, I'll be damned, Hodges muttered, sliding off his horse. That's her. That's the girl, Millie Rawls. He turned toward the boy beside him. Go get her. The boy hesitated. But Papa said, just go. The boy stepped forward. Millie clung to Takwa's side, heart pounding. Don't. Let them take me, she whispered. Please. Takwa stepped in front of her, bow raised, arrow notched. His expression had not changed, but the message was clear. The boy stopped cold. Whoa now, Hodges said, raising his hands mockingly. Ain't no need to draw weapons, Redskin. That there's a white child. Doesn't belong to your kind. Still, Takwa said nothing. Hodges took a step closer. You think she's yours? You steal her? Or is she just one of your trophies? Huh, No reaction. He sneered. Bet she don't even know who you are. Bet she's scared stiff. Millie stepped out from behind Taqwa. I'm not scared of him, she said, voice shaking. He saved me. You didn't. Hodge's eyes narrowed. You belong with your own kind, girl. My own kind threw me in the snow, she snapped. This man, he carried me. He fed me. He kept me alive. Taqwa didn't react, but something deep in his chest warmed. Hodges tightened his grip on his rifle. I could take you both in. Tell the others you ran off with a savage. They'd hang him and beat the truth out of you. Taqwa didn't flinch. He didn't need to. Millie suddenly stepped forward, standing between the rifle and her silent protector. You can try, she said, but I'm not going with you. The boy, still holding the reins, looked between Millie and Hodges, uneasy. Hodges took another step, but then paused. Taqwa hadn't moved, but the arrow in his bow now gleamed in the sunlight, aimed straight at the man's throat. The forest went still. Finally, Hodges spat in the snow. She ain't worth it. He turned away, grumbling, and climbed back onto his horse. You'll regret it, he muttered as he rode off. Mark my words. Long after the sound of hoofbeats faded, Millie remained rooted to the spot, staring into the trees. She turned to Taqwa. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to bring danger here. He knelt in front of her, touched her shoulder gently, and shook his head. The look in his eyes said it all. You are not a burden. You are the reason I still fight. That night, the forest was quiet, but the silence no longer felt safe. The threat of the riders lingered like smoke in the trees. Millie kept glancing toward the dark cave entrance, half expecting to see Hodges's face again, angry and determined. Her hands trembled when she held the wooden fox she'd carved, its rough shape now something of a comfort. Across from her, Taqwa sat in his usual spot, sharpening his knife in slow, thoughtful motions. The fire lit the planes of his face, quiet, focused, weathered by years of wind and pain. But something had changed in him, too. That standoff had brought back memories, ones he kept buried beneath layers of silence. 2 winters ago, this same cave had held the soft breath of another child, his daughter, Wagon. She had been 9 when the fever struck. Just like Millie, she had weakened in stages. First her steps grew unsteady, then her voice grew small, then her eyes stopped shining altogether. Taqwa had done everything. Burned cedar. Called the medicine woman. Boiled roots, his mother swore. Would pull death back from the edge. He had wrapped her in all the warmth he could find and held her as her body burned against him, but the fever didn't break. He remembered the last time she spoke. Sing for me, Papa, she'd whispered. Like you used to. And he had. In a voice cracked with grief and desperation, he had sung her favorite lullaby. She died before the second verse. He hadn't spoken a word since. Words had felt useless, like blowing air into the ashes of a fire that was already gone cold. Now, here was another child lying in the same cave, fighting the same kind of illness. Only this time, she'd lived and each day. She reminded him more of Wagon, not because of how she looked, but because of how she fought to survive. The stubbornness, the spark, the need to laugh in spite of sorrow. Taqwa knew now. He had not saved Millie out of duty or pity. He had done it because something in her reminded him that not everything was meant to be lost. Millie poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks jump. Can I ask you something? She said without looking up. Taqwa raised his head slightly. Did you have a daughter? His eyes didn't move. But the sound of her voice, gentle, respectful, made it impossible to ignore. She looked at him. You gave me that little bear. I figured maybe it belonged to someone you lost. He let out a slow breath through his nose, then nodded. I thought so, she said quietly. What was her name? Taqwa hesitated. Then he reached for a small leather pouch tied around his belt. From it, he pulled a tiny piece of deer hide no bigger than a hand. On it was a design painted in dark berry ink. A circle with a line through it and two smaller marks above. He held it out. Millie took it gently. "What does it mean?" He pointed at the two marks. Eyes, a nod, and a circle. He touched his heart, then the symbol. She stared at it, thinking, then her eyes softened. Her name was Waina. His head dipped confirmation. "I bet she was brave," Millie whispered. "Like you." A flicker passed across his face. Something between pain and pride. Millie set the painted hide carefully in her lap. "My ma used to say grief is love with nowhere to go. But I think maybe it found a way again. Maybe through me." Takwa looked at her. This girl, tossed away like broken glass, now sat in his shelter speaking truths most elders couldn't bear to say, and she wasn't wrong. Later that night, as the fire died to soft embers, Millie curled up beneath the furs. She clutched the bear and the little bird he'd carved for her. She was almost asleep when she murmured, "You don't have to talk, you know. I understand you just fine." Takwa stared into the fire. He didn't respond, but something inside him stirred like a drumbeat beneath the earth, a voice long buried, a song almost forgotten. He rose quietly, walked to the cave mouth, and looked up at the stars. His breath hung in the air. And for the first time in 2 years, he whispered aloud, "Waina." It came like a wind through the trees. He closed his eyes, and in the space between memories, he let it echo. The forest had begun to thaw. Beneath the melting snow, patches of brown earth peeked through, and cold streams flowed faster as the ice released its hold. The air still bit at the skin, but it no longer threatened to kill. Takwa stood just beyond the cave's mouth, scanning the distant ridge. Millie stood beside him, wrapped in thick pelts, her thin arms poking through the sleeves of a coat far too large. Her cheeks were pink now, and her eyes, though cautious, had grown alert. A live dot he pointed east, toward the tree line where the mountain dipped into a long, winding slope. Beyond it lay the river. Beyond that, his people. Safety. How far? Millie asked softly. He held up 3 fingers. 3 days? He nodded. She sighed. "I guess that's not bad, unless it snows again." He said nothing, but his face held a quiet certainty. He had watched the sky each night. The storms had passed. For now, they broke camp early the next morning. Takwa moved with the ease of someone born in the woods. Millie tried to keep up, her legs still unsteady, but her spirit stronger than her steps. She stumbled often, but never asked to stop. When the hills grew steep, Takwa offered his arm. When the wind picked up, he wrapped his own furs around her shoulders. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. Millie talked enough for both of them. "You ever been this way before?" she asked as they crossed a stretch of frozen meadow. "Course you have. You probably know every tree." Takwa offered a faint nod, the corner of his mouth twitching. She smiled. "You should teach me how to track sometime. I can barely hear a rabbit, let alone catch one." He glanced at her boots and bent down to tighten a loose strap. His hands were sure, practiced. "You take care of everything," she said, "like a real father would." He paused but didn't meet her eyes. She didn't press him that night. They built a fire under a hollowed tree and shared strips of smoked venison. Millie carved another animal, a lopsided deer, and Takwa fixed a tear in her mitten. Their silences were no longer awkward. They had become sacred. On the second day, they reached the river. It wasn't wide, but it was moving fast, ice-breaking into jagged slabs carried downstream like knives. A long, narrow log spanned one section where the current had carved a natural crossing. But it was slick with ice. Dangerous. Takwa studied it carefully. Then he looked at Millie. She stared at The log. Her stomach dropped. We have to cross that? He nodded once. She licked her lips. I don't know if I can. He crouched in front of her and pointed to his back, motioning. You're gonna carry me? He nodded again. I'm not too heavy? Another shake of the head. Even after all that rabbit stew? Finally, a flicker of a smile. She climbed onto his back, arms wrapping tight around his neck. Okay, she whispered. Don't let go. Takwa stepped onto the log. The wind picked up and the sound of rushing water roared in their ears. Each step was deliberate, slow. The log dipped slightly under his weight, but his balance never faltered. Millie kept her eyes closed. Halfway across, a branch cracked somewhere in the woods behind them. Takwa stopped. His muscles tensed. Millie peeked over his shoulder. What is it? He didn't answer. But his eyes scanned the tree line. No movement. After a few heartbeats, he pressed forward. The final step brought them to solid ground. Millie exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Takwa crouched to let her down, and her legs nearly gave way. You walk like a mountain goat, she gasped, clutching his arm for balance. A really quiet, really brave mountain goat. He let out a soft exhale that almost sounded like a laugh. She liked that sound. She wanted to hear it again. They camped just a few miles from the village that night. Takwa gathered kindling while Millie arranged stones around the fire pit. The river behind them sounded calmer now, the wind less biting. There was a peace in the air, fragile but real. Are your people gonna like me? Millie asked suddenly. I'm not exactly what they're expecting, right? Takwa looked up. For a long moment, he studied her, then reached into his satchel and pulled out a strip of beaded cloth woven with deep red and bright turquoise. He tied it gently around her wrist. Millie blinked. What's this? He tapped his chest, then hers, then the bracelet. It was a symbol. You are part of this now, part of me, part of home. Millie swallowed hard and looked away, blinking back tears. I've never belonged anywhere, she whispered, but I think maybe I do now. Takwa sat beside her and watched the fire burn down to coals. He still didn't speak. They reached the Shawnee village at dawn. Millie had never seen anything like it. Tucked between the forest and the riverbank, the village blended with the land as if it had grown from the ground itself. Smoke curled from large holes. Animal hides flapped gently in the breeze. Children's laughter echoed faintly through the trees, though most of the people were just waking. It was peaceful yet full of quiet strength. As they stepped into view, all motion stopped. Eyes turned. Conversations died. Millie felt every gaze on her like cold water. She shrank a little behind Takwa, her hand tightening around the beaded bracelet he had given her the night before. A few warriors rose to their feet, brows furrowed. One elderly man stepped forward, staff in hand. His voice was low and firm, spoken in Shawnee words Millie couldn't understand, but the tone was clear. Is this? Why is she here? Takwa stood tall, silent, as always. But he stepped slightly to the side, enough to make room for Millie beside him, not behind. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. Then he looked directly at the elder, eyes steady, and slowly tapped his chest once. Then hers, then pointed to the earth at their feet. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. He said, "She is his," translated a woman softly from the crowd. "That this is her home now." Millie turned to see the speaker, a kind-eyed woman with silver threads in her braids and an armful of firewood. The woman gave her a small, encouraging smile. Then came the medicine woman. Old, tall, and bent with time, she moved slowly between the people and approached Takwa. Her eyes sharp and knowing drifted from him to Millie. She studied the child, head to toe, then back again. She stepped close to Millie and held out a hand. Millie hesitated, then placed her small, pale fingers in the old woman's warm palm. The woman examined her wrist, where the beaded bracelet shimmered. "You carry the marks of family," she said softly in accented English. "Then family you shall be." With a nod, she turned to the people and declared something in Shawnee that brought a shift in the crowd. Tension softened. The villagers didn't smile yet, but they stepped back, made space. A pathway opened, and just like that, Millie was allowed in. Takwa led her to a lodge made of willow poles and thick hides. It was quiet inside, smelling of sage and smoke. He motioned for her to sit by the fire pit in the center, then left briefly. When he returned, he brought blankets, warm broth, and a small bundle of items, a wooden comb, a woven sash, and a small pouch of herbs. "For me?" Millie asked, blinking. He nodded that she smiled. "You don't talk much, but you sure know how to say a lot." Later that day, children peeked through the flaps of the lodge. One girl, no older than 10, giggled and whispered to the others. Eventually, 2 of them dared to come in. They offered Millie a carved fox toy, then ran back outside. Giggling, Millie turned to Takwa. "They don't hate me." He nodded. She frowned thoughtfully. "But they don't know me either." He paused, then reached behind him and pulled out a small knife and block of wood. He handed them to her. "Another carving?" she asked. He nodded. "What should I make?" He looked around, then pointed to her heart. Millie's brows rose. "Something from in here?" He gave a small smile. She nodded slowly, understanding. "All right," she said. "I'll try." That evening, the village gathered for a modest celebration. It wasn't loud or wild, just a simple meal around the central fire and songs sung by the elders. Millie sat beside Takwa, a warm bowl in her lap, her eyes wide as she watched the dances and listened to the drums. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Belonging. At one point, an elder stood and told a story of a hawk that lost its wings and was carried by a bear to the sky. As the tale ended, she looked directly at Millie. "Are the hawk," she said in English, "and you have found your sky." Millie's throat tightened. Takwa reached out and rested a hand over hers. Not a word passed between them, but his silence had never spoken louder. But as she leaned against his shoulder and closed her eyes, the silence between them said everything that needed to be said. Spring came early to the valley. The snow melted into rivers that rushed fast and clear, and the earth awoke with green shoots and birdsong. The Shawnee village stirred with life, mothers grinding corn, children running barefoot through thawed fields, men preparing for long hunts. And in the middle of it all, Millie found her rhythm. She no longer flinched when someone looked at her too long. She no longer shrank from the language or the silence. She learned to wash hides, to thread beads, and even how to notch an arrow. She was, in every way that mattered, one of them. Takwa watched her grow stronger with quiet pride. Her laughter came easier now. Her smile was real. And every night, when she carved by the fire or tied knots beside him, he felt the ache in his chest slowly easing like old wounds that were finally allowed to breathe. But peace, Takwa knew, never lasted long, and blood, once spilled, always found its way back. It began with hoofbeats again. This time, Takwa heard them long before anyone else. The village was preparing a feast that evening. Millie had even helped pluck pheasants, and laughter echoed across the clearing. Then Takwa's eyes turned to the ridge. The sound was wrong. Too many hooves. Too fast. By the time the first scout spotted the riders, Takwa had already stepped in front of Millie. He didn't need to guess who it was. The settlers came riding hard. 5 men this time. Hodges led them, teeth bared in something between a sneer and a grin. Behind him, Emmett Rawls rode with fury in his eyes, his coat flapping like a black flag. They didn't come to talk. They came to take. She's ours." Hodges roared, raising his rifle as the village came into view. "You stole her. We've got law behind us now." Takwa stepped forward without hesitation, his bow already drawn. He made no sound, but his silence was louder than gunfire. Emmett's eyes locked on Millie. "Girl," he barked, "you get over here now, you hear me? You think you can shame your family by living like a savage?" Millie's heart thundered. Her legs moved without her meaning to. But she didn't step forward, she stepped behind Takwa. She spoke clearly. "You're not my family." Emmett's face twisted. "You ungrateful little." But before he could finish, Takwa raised his hand, not with a weapon. With a single sharp gesture, behind him, several Shawnee warriors appeared from the trees, bows strung, arrows aimed. The women and children had already been ushered back, and the firelight glinted off the arrowheads like stars. "This is our land," said the elder Takwa had first spoken to, "and the girl is under our protection. She's white." Hodges snapped. "You can't just—" "She is not yours to claim," the elder interrupted calmly. "She is not property. She is not trade. She is a child." Hodges sneered. "We'll see what the U.S. Army thinks of that." "You brought no soldiers," Takwa finally said. It was the first word any of them had ever heard him speak in years. "Even." Hodges went still. Emmett scowled. "So now you talk." Takwa stepped forward. His voice, low and gravel-edged, cut like a blade. "She was thrown away, left for dead. You call her yours only now because she lived." Millie stood beside him, her hands shaking, but her voice didn't tremble. "I chose to stay," she said. "You made your choice in the snow." Emmett looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time. There was no weakness in her eyes anymore, no fear, just resolve. He spat on the ground. "Then stay dead to me." He yanked his reins hard, turning his horse. Hodges looked like he might say more, but thought better of it. One glance at the silent archers watching from the trees told him everything he needed to know. The riders turned back toward the ridge and were gone. The village slowly returned to motion. Takwa didn't move for a long time. He stared at the trail, bow lowered now, chest heaving. Millie stood beside him, breathing hard. Then, finally, she looked up at him. "You spoke," she whispered. He turned to her. "Because I had to." Millie smiled softly. "Then I'll remember every word." That night, as the village gathered around the fire, Takwa sat beside Millie and let her braid his long black hair with beads and feathers. The children had gifted her. He didn't speak again that night, but he didn't need to, because Millie leaned against him and said what he had carried in his heart since the moment he found her in the snow. "You're my father now." And the fire didn't flicker. It burned steady and bright. Summer came slowly to the valley, spreading warmth like a healing balm across the land. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides, and the river ran steady and clean. Life moved with rhythm again, planting, harvesting, gathering, sharing. The village thrived. And so did Millie. She had grown stronger, taller. Her cheeks held the sun. Her hands had learned to braid rope, stitch moccasins, tan hides. The pale, half-frozen girl Takwa had carried from the snow was gone. In her place stood someone new, not quite Shawnee by blood, but wholly Shawnee by heart. And the time had come for the people to honor that. The naming ceremony was held just after dusk. A fire had been lit in the center of the village, ringed by smooth stones and surrounded by every member of the tribe, young, old, hunters, children, mothers, warriors. Even those who once looked at her with suspicion now sat with quiet respect. In their eyes, Millie stood beside Takwa, dressed in a soft deerhide dress the women had sewn for her. Beads in turquoise and red glimmered across the hem. Her hair was freshly braided with a single white feather tied behind her ear. She couldn't stop fidgeting. "I don't think I deserve a name," she whispered nervously. Takwa crouched slightly beside her and tapped her wrist where the woven band still sat. Then he tapped her chest. "Her heart. You've already earned it." The elder stepped forward, holding a bowl of smoking herbs. Her eyes were clear as river stones, her voice strong despite her age. "In our ways," she said, "a name is not given lightly. A name tells the world who you are, what you carry, and where you belong. It speaks before you speak. It lives longer than breath." She turned to Millie. "You came to us as a stranger, a child without protection, left by those who should have cared for you. But you did not die. You did not fade. You grew. You gave. You became one of us." Millie's breath caught. The elder reached into a pouch and drew out a small carved pendant shaped like a wing, painted with earth-red ochre and bound with braided sinew. She held it up. "Your name shall be Ayoka. It means she brought joy." Hush swept the crowd. Millie's eyes filled with tears. "Because even when you were broken," the elder continued, "you gave us light. You reminded us that loss does not end us. That silence can still be love. That family is not just made of blood but of choice." The pendant was placed around her neck. Millie Ayoka clutched it tightly, trying not to cry. But she saw Takwa watching her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. He didn't need to smile. His pride was in every breath. And then, to everyone's surprise, Takwa stepped forward. He raised a hand, not in silence, but in greeting, and he spoke. Not many words. "Just enough. She is my daughter, now and always." The crowd stirred. Some gasped. Some bowed their heads. The man who had not spoken in years had found his voice because of her. And Millie Ayoka stepped toward him and took his hand in both of hers. "I always wanted someone to choose me," she whispered. "Thank you." He gave her a long look, then pulled a bundle from beneath his robe. It was the carved bear, the one Wayna once held, now polished, restored, tied with a new ribbon. He pressed it into her hands, and she knew what it meant. "You carry her spirit now, and I carry you." That night, as the fire burned low and stars scattered across the sky, Millie sat beside Takwa on a small hill above the village. The wind whispered through the grass. Owls called from the pines. "I'm not scared anymore," she said, breaking the quiet. Takwa looked at her. "Of being left behind," she clarified. "Of being thrown away." She looked down at the name around her neck. "I think maybe I was always meant to end up here." He nodded just once, and after a long silence, he spoke again. "You were never lost."